welcome everyone. This is the last day of classes of the semester, so I'm feeling some more students have already flown the coop. But I'm very grateful that you're here. We're recording this lecture so that we will all have it to keep and share. And I think that'll be valuable, because we certainly, one of the lessons we know from this is that it's so important to hold on to valuable knowledge and keep it for generations. And that's really a lesson I learned first from Chief Harry Wallace when I went to my very first East End Multicultural Council meeting and asked what were some of the interests and priorities in the community. And he let me know, all of us at the meeting, that this was a priority, but that there wasn't real interest in linguistics of the Algic languages, Algonkian languages at Stony Brook University. And I always knew that it was one of the first meetings I ever had, and I thought, this is such a fascinating topic. This just can't be true. I have to find out for myself. And so I looked up who the linguists were and found that the vice provost at Stony Brook for undergraduate education was actually a prominent linguist. And I went into his office, and there was a giant map about 3 feet by 5 feet in his office. It was a map of native languages in North America. And I thought, well, I think I've come to the right office. And sure enough, and he then put us in touch with Bob Hoberman, also the linguistics department, who is an authority on reclaiming language. His experience is studying how in Israel, they made a conscious decision to have modern Hebrew when it had been a dead language, only used in prayers. And today, as we all know, it's a living, thriving language. So that really is the beautiful vision for the languages of Long Island. And I'm just so delighted with the support and interest and the intellectual acumen of the interest groups from the Unkachag and Shinnecock nations, matched by tremendous enthusiasm and intellectual rigor on the part of members of the linguistics department. And where it comes together is in the person of Howard Treadwell, who is a product not only of the Unkachag Nation, but also of Stony Brook University as a recent graduate. I'm so glad you're here tonight, Howard, because you're going to be a shining star as this project continues, as well as Josephine Smith from the Shinnecock Nation, who's worked so hard to bring language back, reclaim language in the Shinnecock Nation as well. So we're a small but select crowd, and a look in the spring for a big splash and announcement of how we're really going to go forward with this. I'll just say a few words about our speaker, because he comes from a very interesting background. He grew up in a farm in Canada where he just learned in days, nights like this, he had to pour hot water down the pump to prime it, to pump it out. And, so I think there are people in the audience who have similar memories. And then he got older, and he went to one of Canada's most prestigious universities, McGill. And then when he graduated, he went to a very prestigious university in this country, MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, to study linguistics. And then in 1974, he was asked to come to Stony Brook for a one-year appointment, so he came, and he stayed. And he became the founding chair of the linguistics department, and then he was called to be vice provost for all of undergraduate studies. Along the way, he studied many languages, and we'll hear about that from him. After serving out his sentence as vice provost, he's going to be returning to teaching next year, his first love. So it's really a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming out to join us tonight. Aronoff.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you all for having me out here. I'm going to talk about language and what legitimation, and I'll explain to you what legitimation is. This is something I've thought about for a long time in relation to my own work, and since I guess sometime in the spring, I've been talking to Mary about some of the efforts here, and I met Harry actually last spring, and I thought, well, there is some connection, and actually I think there's a very interesting connection especially to Algonkian languages and this question of what we call legitimation. So I'm going to try and explain this to you. You may have to bear with me, and if there's anything that's unclear, we're not a very large group, please feel free to raise a hand and ask a question. There's a little bit of technical linguistic stuff in this, but I'm going to see if I can get you through the technical linguistic stuff. The whole background of this really is, which I think you have to keep in mind, is something that's fascinated me for a long time, and this is this notion of how big the world is and how big people's worlds are. And we all live in the 21st century, and so I think we have a notion of the world, which is we have this, there's this big world, and it's a big globe, and we know all about all of the people living all over the whole world. But in fact, for most of human history, that has not been true. In fact, that's only been true very, very recently. I would say really it's only, within the last century at most that people have had this notion. Previous to that, people's notion of what their world was really very, very small. And so, and that's something that's fascinated me, and that's kind of what's driving this this talk. So, if I can find the button that will, is that going to get me there? Okay. So I'm going to start with making a distinction, and that linguists make, between what we call language and languages. Another way to look at it is what linguists will sometimes call the capacity for language, the human capacity for language, versus individual languages. My main point here, which is really, and it's just something that you need to know before we start the discussion, is that all human individuals and all human groups have a capacity for language. And humans are born with this capacity, and it's really, in some ways, what makes us different from every other creature on Earth is that we have a capacity to acquire a language. So children, when they're born, in some sense, they're born with that ability. And which I just want to distinguish that from individual languages. So I speak English, right? A person may speak Shinnecock, or a person may speak Tewa, and those are individual languages. So there's this sort of general human capacity for language, and then there are these individual languages. And what's important is that every society, every human society, identifies with its language. It's sort of when somebody says, I am a Navajo, what they're identifying not just with that group, with that nation, but they're also identifying with the language of that group. That's kind of what makes them a member of the group in some sense. Okay, so one question that you might ask is, well, how old is this capacity for language that people have? And really the answer is that we don't know. It's at least as old as the human species. And the modern human species is at least 150,000 years old, which in terms of geological time is actually not very long. But so I think it's reasonable, and pretty much any anthropologist, physical anthropologist or linguist will tell you that modern humans came out of Africa. We're pretty sure of that. They came out of Africa somewhere about 100,000 years ago. And they came out of Africa with this, what we call capacity for language. In other words, with the ability to acquire a human language. All right, next question though is, how old is any individual language? So you might ask, let's say, well, how old is English? And for linguists, that's actually a pretty silly question, because you really can't tell. You don't know. There's no way to know when a language began. You can't say, well, English began when the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes came from the north coast of Schleswig-Holstein, or wherever they came from, and they sailed their boats and they came to England. Well, they came there with the language that they were already speaking. So there's no way to say, well, my language began at a certain moment. It's not really a sensible question. I'm going to skip this next slide. One way to ask yourself, well, how did languages begin, is to look at the myth of Babel, right? So this is the Tower of Babel. I think you can kind of see it. And if you know your book of Genesis, you know that according to the book of Genesis, people originally spoke one language. And that what happened was that God, or the gods, depending on how you read the book of Genesis and how you read that particular chapter, got upset with these people because they were trying to build this big tower. And so what they did was that they kind of condemned them to speak different languages, so that people would not understand each other and they wouldn't be able to work together. And that's, of course, true today as well. So if you look around the world and you ask yourself, well, how many languages are there in the world? The answer is there's about 6,000 different languages that people speak around the world today. Unfortunately, that number is dwindling because a lot of these languages are disappearing because the global languages like Chinese and English are more or less taking over. But there's still probably 5,000 or 6,000 different languages spoken in the world today. Well, if all people are the same in some sense, and I think that any expert on human origins will tell you all people are the same. Well, why is it that if all people are the same, they have thousands of different languages? Why should that be? What is the value? Why do people have so many different languages? So, and I have here on the slide, compare dog language. So, how many dog languages are there? Well, the answer is there's only one dog language. And it's very easy. You can do an experiment. You could take a dog from Southampton, and you could take a dog from Japan, right? And they will bark the same barks. And they will make the same growls. They will understand each other perfectly. So all dogs speak the same dog language. And that's true, for example, pretty much any other creatures on Earth, that every creature, all cats on Earth have the same cat language. Well, why is it that we have so many different human languages? Why, what is the reason? Is it just that God decided that we have to not speak to one another? Well, actually, people who've thought about this have a number of theories. One theory, which something that I was speaking to a biologist about, it's a little complicated, is what biologists call kin selection. And that is that you tend to favor people who are related to you. And having different languages is a way of separating people so that in some sense they know who's related to them. Another way of looking at that is, again, a fancy term, we call it within group identity. In other words, if I speak my language and you speak your language, then I know if you're a member of my group or if you're not a member of my group. There's again, to quote from the Bible, there's this wonderful passage that, I don't know how many people here know the word shibboleth, but right, and that's a word from the Bible, which involves a story where there are these two groups of people that are having a fight with one another, having a war, and there's a password and the password is shibboleth. And the reason why the password is shibboleth is because if it turns out that if you're a member of one side of this war, then you pronounce sh, and if you're from the other side, you can't pronounce sh, you can only say sa. So if you ask somebody, what's the password? And if they say Sibboleth instead of Shibboleth, well, then you just chop off their head, right? Because they don't have they're speaking the wrong dialect. So in a way, you could say, well, that's one of the functions of people speaking differently. We were having a little discussion at dinner today about the local languages here being what they call our dialect, right? And then there was, and I can't remember who it was who said that here, I think in the Shinnecock, there was a Y dialect, right? And what that does is, some people say R, some people say Y. It's a way of actually keeping people apart. I know when I was a kid, I grew up in Canada. When I was a kid, I hung out with the other kids that went to my school, and I never hung out with the kids who went to Catholic school. And we knew who went to Catholic school because they didn't talk like us, right? So for kids, they're actually very sensitive to this sort of thing. You know who is, your person and who is not your person, who's a member of your crowd, who's not a member of your crowd. And very often it really is just by the way they speak. So language actually serves that function of being able to tell you, all right, who is a member of my tribe, i.e. the kids who don't go to Catholic school, and who is not a member of my tribe, right? Okay, now, here's where I want to take you back to this notion of, people sort of, what people were like originally. And my point here is that, in fact, for most of human existence, people have lived in very small groups. So when I talk about my group of kids versus your group of kids, I think if you really go back, and you don't have to go back very far, we're talking about my village versus your village. And in fact, these human villages were really, really small. There is some evidence that's, again, somewhat complicated, that says that really, in terms of functioning groups of humans, the maximal size of people who really are part of the same group is about 150. This is also sometimes used in corporations. So when you ask, what is the maximal number of people who can actually work together, the answer is about 150. Once you get above 150, then they already, you tend to split. And in fact, if you look at early societies, what we call hunter-gatherer societies, it turns out that most of those societies, the sort of average number for people in those societies was around 1,500 people. It really, which today we would think of as being minuscule, but in fact, that was the size of many of these sort of earlier groups of people, about 1,500. Okay, now, question is, what does that tell us about language? And also, what does it tell us about what the language was doing? So, again, we have to take us out of this global world that we live in and ask ourselves, well, how did people interact? And how many people did people know about, in some sense? And sometimes when I think about these questions, I'm reminded of the stories of Marco Polo. So, which is, when Marco Polo lived around 1200. So that's what, 800 years ago. And 800 years ago, the people in Europe didn't really know that there were people living in China. They kind of knew, they heard about them. They heard that, there were these people that were living on the other side of the world somewhere. And what Marco Polo did was he went and walked to China and lived with those people and came back and told the people in Europe, hey, there are these people that are living out there in China. And the point is that in 1200, they didn't know about people living on the other side of the same continent, right? Because Europe and China, it's one big continent. People on one side didn't really know about the people living on the other side. And of course, before Columbus, the people in Europe didn't know that there were people living in the Americas. In fact, they didn't even know there were any Americas, right? What I'm trying to get across here is that up until very, very recently, most people's notion of what the world was really a very small, it was a small place. So if we go back here, let's say we take ourselves back on Long Island, let's say 500 years ago, and you ask yourself, all right, let's say you were a Shinnecock 500 years ago, and you were living here in what we now call Southampton 500 years ago, and you knew that, well, there was Unkachaws, and the Unkachaws were living over there, right? And you knew that there was people in Connecticut, but that was pretty much all that you knew. You really didn't know more than that. Your world was, the notion of how big the world was and how many different people existed, lived in the world, was really, really very small. And furthermore, for the most part, people, they knew about other people, but they didn't really believe that they were real people. Right? They said, oh, well, yeah, I know there's some other people that are living over there, but they're not real people. They're something else. They're savages, they're barbarians, they're not real like I am, right? So I'm going to give you some linguistic examples of what that meant. And I'll run through a few examples just to give you an idea of this notion that, well, I'm a real person and my people are real people, and those other people over there, they're not real, they're not legitimate. That's my point, is that I'm legitimate, but those other people are not. All right, this title here, right, this is actually Greek, and it's classical Greek, and the word is hoi barbaroi, and hoi is classical Greek for the, right? So hoi barbaroi means the barbarians. So the classical Greeks believed that there was them, right? Me, classical Greek, me, Greek. They didn't actually call themselves Greek, they called themselves whatever they called themselves, Hellenes or Mycenaeans. And they thought that everybody else who wasn't Greek was barbaros. Well, this is an interesting word, barbaros. And if you look back at the origin of this word, what the origin of the word is, it actually comes from a kind of an imitative expression, which is barbar, which is that's really what it is. So the ancient Greeks thought that anybody who wasn't one of them, anybody who didn't speak their language, what they spoke was just gibberish, right? And so that's what they called them. They actually called them barbar. That was their name for these other people. And as far as they were concerned, these people were barbarians, okay? So what do we mean by barbarians? Well, I have some random pictures here of barbarians. These pictures, these are actually pictures of Caliban. So Caliban was the Native American in Shakespeare. I don't know how many people know this, but there was one Native American character in Shakespeare. And this was this Caliban who was in The Tempest. Now, they don't tell you he was Native American, but what they tell you is that he was a monster. Because when did Shakespeare live? He lived in 1600. And for him, that's what these people were. They were just strange creatures. They were just monsters, right? They were barbarians because why? Because they couldn't understand their language. That was really what the problem was, that they didn't speak a language that they knew. Here's some modern pictures of barbarians. It's my favorite one. So now it's sort of common in these. This is, I believe, a British barbarian. He's smoking a cigarette. It's a rather fat barbarian. Which barbarian is this? It's Conan the Barbarian, right? So another one of my favorite, and this is actually my favorite barbarian. You're really dating yourself if you know who this barbarian is. All right, who's going to tell me? It's Barbarella, right? It was actually Jane Fonda, about 40 years ago, probably, right? But my point here is that we have this notion of us, members of our group who speak our language, and barbarians, and everybody else is a barbarian. If they don't speak our language, they're barbarians. I give you some other examples here. This is actually, I like this one. This is a language from a people called Huave. And just like the Greeks called the other people barbarians, what the Huave did was they didn't have a word for other people. They just had a word for us. And they had a word for our language, but they didn't even have a word for anybody else. It was just us and them. That was really what it was. Another language that I happen to have studied for a while is called Arapesh. And what's interesting about Arapesh is they don't really have a word for their language, but they have a word, Arapen, which means friend, and then the plural of Arapen is Arapesh, means friends. So for them, it was simply our friends versus our enemies. So our friends is our group. Anybody else who is not my friend is not a member of my group. He's not really a person. Some pictures of, a student of mine actually was kind of inspired by my work in Arapesh, and she went and lived there for a few years and studied their language, which was gratifying to me. Though I never managed to get there, but I did learn a little bit about the language. But just to give you an example from Algonkian, I think this is something that most people here know, which just a little bit about the Algonkian language family. Here's a picture of the extent of how widespread this language family was. And I'll get back to Algonkian in a minute. But the point that I'm trying to make here, this is Eastern Algonkian. Here we are. Whoops, wrong pointer. We're there, right there. That's Shinnecock, right here. Right? Okay. But the Algonkian word, at least the Central Algonkian word, for a person who is a member of their group is Anishinaabe. Right? Anishinaabe is us, or human being. And that's what I like about the Central Algonkian word, is that the word for the people is human being. So anybody who was not Anishinaabe was simply not a human being. Right? So I think that's a sort of general human tendency to say, if you speak my language, you are a person. If you don't speak my language, you are not a person. Okay, let's talk about legitimation. Basically, legitimation is, and I've given you a dictionary definition which says the act or process of making legitimate. And when I talk about legitimation, what I mostly mean is that legitimation is a way of breaking out of this pattern. So if I say, by legitimating something, what I'm saying is that especially by legitimating a person or a language, I'm saying that you are a real person and you have a real language. Now, why this matters here and why I'm talking about it today is because it turns out that for Amerindian languages and Amerindian peoples, one of the major routes towards this legitimation, towards the recognition that people really were real people and not just barbarians, was through their language. So the early North American linguists, what they did, and that's what I'm going to talk about, and this is where we're going to get a little technical, but I hope not too technical. What they did was they studied the native languages of North America. And they studied these languages and used the grammatical structure of the languages to prove to people that the societies were in fact legitimate societies, that they were real, that they were not inferior, but that they were equal societies to the white society of North America. So, this is a quote here. It's a very long quote, but I'll give you a minute to look at it. So Leonard Bloomfield was one of the first American linguists, and he devoted his entire life, or most of his life, to studying Algonkian languages. That's what he did. Mostly it was Central Algonkian languages, because that's where he lived. And he lived in the Midwest, and he would spend his summers studying Ojibwe and Cree and Menominee, and I'm trying to remember what the other one was. We'll find out in a minute. And what he did was he studied those languages and then used the structure of those languages to prove to other professors that these languages were just as good as any other. In other words, he actually demonstrated that those languages were just as complicated as English or Latin or German, and that therefore they were just as legitimate as these other languages. Now, he eventually became a professor at Yale. So he was a very, very well-known guy. He died in, I think, 1946. And what I want to try and do today is to show you exactly the sort of work that Bloomfield did in order to demonstrate his point. So this is going to be technical linguistic stuff, but I think you should be able to follow it. Now, an important point that Bloomfield made was that all languages are equal. And in fact, in particular, he tried to prove to people that the languages of the Americas were on the same footing as European languages, that they were equal to European languages. Now, how did he do this? He did this in a very, very interesting way, which I'm going to try and show to you. Okay. So, how do we know that two languages are related to one another? This was actually something that linguists discovered in the 19th century. So in 1785, a man by the name of William Jones, who was a British colonial officer in India, was studying Sanskrit, which was the holy language of India. And he wrote an article that said, hey, there's something going on here. Sanskrit is a lot like Greek and Latin. Now, India for them was, this uncivilized place at the end of the world. So what was going on? And what he said was, well, these languages are so similar to one another that they must be related in some way. And that started kind of the whole of modern linguistics, what we call modern linguistics. It was 18th century, but this whole notion of trying to trace languages and trying to relate them to one another. And languages, the way in which languages are, you can show that they're related to one another is not that they have the same words, but that they have different words, but that they're different in a kind of consistent way. So in particular, how do we know that English is related to Latin? The answer is that when you find an English word with a T, you're going to find a Latin word with a D. Right? So you see here English 10, Latin decem, English 2, Latin duo, English toe, Latin duco, English tooth, Latin dent. So see, you have all these D's here and all these T's here. That's what shows you that two languages are related to one another. Not that they have the same sound, but that they have these, what we call correspondences, right? Now, this doesn't just work by looking at English and Latin and German and many other languages, you can actually reconstruct what we call Indo-European. which is you can show that all of the languages that go all the way from India to Ireland, not all of them, but most of them are actually related to one another, and they're related to one another in this kind of way. And I won't bother you with more detail about it. But you could also, here's another example. So every time you see an English th, you'll see a Latin t. So English 3, Latin tres. English father, Latin pater. English thin, Latin tenuis. Father, notice you get brother, right, with the th sound. You also, in Latin, you get, does anybody know? What's the Latin word for brother?
Frater?
Frater, right? So again, it's the and the T. In fact, the English B in brother corresponds to Latin F, but we won't go into that, right? But you can do this for other languages. It's hard to see here, but this is Polynesian. So all of the languages from Hawaii to New Zealand are related to one another. Because those are all Polynesian people, they all traveled all around the Pacific, and you can tell that they're related to one another in the languages that I've given here. I'm sorry, the size of the type. Tongan, Samoan, Maori, Rapa Nui, Rarotongan, Hawaiian, and you can actually see these relations. So for example, this Hawaiian word for one is kahi, and the Maori word for one is tahi. So where you have a Hawaiian K, you have a Maori T. And you can see this correspondence running through. Now, the fact that they're not the same. They're different. Now, why are they different? Well, the answer is very simple. They're different because of what we call sound change. So again, we were having a discussion at dinner about the Algonkian languages with L and the Algonkian languages with R, right? And how are they related? Well, they're related because probably originally they all had R, and then somebody decided, well, I'm going to say L instead of R, right? It's a little bit like my Uncle Harry, who was a taxi driver in New York City and used to talk about going to 120 Street, right? Well, did my Uncle Harry speak English? Well, he did speak English. He spoke a particular kind of New York English that had a sound change. It had a number of sound changes. The one in particular that interests us in this case was that English TH, as in third or three, becomes Brooklyn T, right? So
it's not like Castilian and Latino?
Right, same, right? So Castilian, actually what happened is it's a complicated story, but it's a similar,
TH.
right, the TH and the, right. It's actually the TH and the S in, so it's the in Castilian, but it's in Latin American. So those are what we call sound changes, okay? So what Leonard Bloomfield did, which is really very cool, was he said, well, look, I have all of these Algonkian languages that I've studied. I've studied Fox. Remember, these are all Central Algonkian languages. I've studied Fox. I've studied Cree, Menominee, Ojibwa, right? Because he, at the time, as I said, he would go out and spend his summers with these different people. He said, I've studied all these languages, and I've noticed something about these languages, which is that they're related to each other through sound change in the same way that English and Latin are related to each other. So what he discovered is, now this is what we call ProtoAlgonkian. So what he did was he used these languages and compared them to construct, it was really Proto-Central Algonkian because he wasn't looking at Eastern Algonkian. But he was comparing all of those Central Algonkian languages and saying that I can show you that they're related to one another. So in this particular case, what you can see is that in Fox you have a letter E. In Cree you have a letter I. In linguists we would call this A and E, because we put them in, that's the phonetic symbol. The phonetic symbol is A and E. So what this says is that Fox A and Menominee A correspond to Cree E and Ojibwa E, right? So any word in Fox that has this A vowel will have an E vowel in Cree and Ojibwa, right? Everybody sees that? Now, any word in Fox that has an E will also have an A in Menominee, right? So you go through, these are correspondences of, and their work, the point that Bloomfield was trying to make, and you don't really need to follow through all of the examples. The point that Bloomfield was trying to make was that just the way people study English and Latin, or Greek, or Sanskrit, or Russian, or any of these European languages, you can take exactly those same scholarly methods and apply those scholarly methods to the native languages of North America, in his case Central Algonkian, and you can do the same kind of work, you can make the same kind of discoveries. So that these languages, what he was really saying was that the languages of North America work in just the same way as the languages of Europe work, right? Actually, I didn't show you this, but this, you can see on this slide that there's another change here, which is Proto-Algonkian sh is sh in Fox and s in Cree and Menominee. This is what I was talking about when I talked about shibboleth. So there's actually a natural thing in languages that have sh, there's a kind of a natural tendency for that sh to turn into s, because s is kind of it's just like sh, but it's simpler, right? So all of that, basically, what he was able to do through all of that was to say, all right, I can now reconstruct what he called Proto-Algonkian, which is actually Proto-Central Algonkian, and I can reconstruct what the language was like, I don't know, let's say 1,000 years ago, by comparing these languages. And the point again is, I'm doing the same thing that anybody is doing with the European language, because these languages work in exactly the same way that European languages work. Okay, now I'm going to move from talking about Algonkian to talking about my own work. I work with sign languages. And one of the amazing things with sign languages is that it's one of the few areas where you can actually say that linguists have had an effect on general society. And the effect that linguists had was through this, what I call legitimation. So what linguists did was they actually proved that deaf people had a language. And they proved it linguistically in the same way that Bloomfield proved that North American people had languages. So I won't go into the technical part of how they did this, but basically, if you go back before 1960 and you look at what the attitude was towards deaf people and their language, the answer is that most people thought that deaf people were stupid. I mean, there was a reason why they were called deaf and dumb. And dumb didn't just mean that they didn't speak. People really thought that deaf people were just not, they weren't quite up to it. They weren't quite there. And one reason why they thought that was because they didn't think that deaf people had a language. They thought that deaf people just made signs with their hands. And what happened was that one particular linguist, his name was William Stokey, actually, he happened to be teaching in Gallaudet College, which was a college for deaf people in Washington. And at the time, if you went to Gallaudet College and you were deaf, you didn't use the sign language. What you used was either what they call signed English, or you tried to speak English, because nobody felt that the sign language was a real language. And what he proved was he did a linguistic analysis that demonstrated that, in fact, this sign language was a language. Interestingly, we call it, I think everybody here knows that the language of deaf people in North America is called American Sign Language. That wasn't true 50 years ago. They didn't have a name. It didn't have any name. It just, because people didn't think it was a language. It was actually this guy Stony who called it American Sign Language. So what he did was, by demonstrating that these people had a real language, he was able to give legitimacy to the community. So that now, deaf people in North America really have they have an identity which is organized around their language. Okay, well, this slide gives you a little too much of history and all of that. I don't. That's not that crucial. Okay, that's my point, which is that by saying people have a real language, you can actually say they are real people, right? Now, what I want to do is to turn to the language that I work on myself. This is a sign language that is used in a Bedouin village. The Bedouin village happens to be in the Negev desert in Israel. It's a very interesting language. This is an example of one of the people that one of the deaf people in this particular village. I took a picture of this guy because we have this notion of Bedouins as living in tents. Well, you know, you can see this guy's living in a suburban house. He's got a TV. He lives pretty much like you and me. This was the man I mentioned earlier who earns a living driving a road grader, right? And in fact, many of the houses in this Bedouin village would fit in very nicely in some of the more prosperous parts of Long Island. It's just that they are Bedouins. They live by themselves in their own village. They just happen to live particularly well. This, on the other hand, this is a picture I took about, a year or so ago. It's another picture of this Bedouin village. This is more like what you think a Bedouin village is going to look like. This woman here, we were interested in working with her because she was married to one of the first deaf people in the village. She herself is not deaf, but her husband was deaf. And so we were interested in studying her signing. Okay, so what is this language? Well, this is a language that's been around for for exactly 3 generations. It's a sign language. It's used by both hearing and deaf people in this village in the Negev desert in Israel. It's pretty much the second language of this village. People just use it like a normal language in the village. The village was founded about 1830. I can give you more historical details about it. And in about the 1930s, deaf people kind of began to be born in this village. We work mostly with the second generation of deaf people, but we also work with some of the younger deaf people in the village. What's really amazing about this language and why we're interested in it is it appears to have arisen just completely spontaneously in this village. It just sort of grew up in the village and at least originally without any outside influence. One of my favorite stories is we try to find out, do the deaf people in the village, do they understand deaf people who don't live in their village? And so these people watch TV a lot, and on the news program, especially the news that comes from Jordan, they have somebody who is signing. They have a kind of it's not captioned in the sense of written at the bottom. It's like in a corner of the screen, there's somebody who is signing, and they're signing the sign language of Jordan. It's not the sign language of the village, it's the sign language of Jordan, which is like 30 miles away, right? And so we were talking to one of the deaf guys in the village, and we say, do you ever watch this news program? And he says, yeah. He says, this is one of my favorite programs. And we say, well, do you watch the guy, signing here up in the corner? He says, yeah. He says, I love to watch that guy. It's the funniest thing I've ever seen. I don't understand a word. Right? So it's clear that they have their own sign language, and that's one of the people I work with happens to be deaf. And when we first went into the village, we sat down and we were talking to these people, and people were signing, and she just started grinning. And we said to her, Carol, why are you grinning? Why are you so happy? She says, I don't understand the world. A word that they're saying, this must be a real language because I don't understand any of it, right? So that's the language that we study, and mostly what we're interested in finding out is how a language grows. So if you get a group of people who create a language, what happens to that language over time? The problem that these people have is genetic. It's a recessive gene. I could go into the actual genetics of it. But they are born completely deaf. They cannot hear anything. They're absolutely deaf from birth. It's recessive, so you don't know who's going to be deaf in the village. Your parents can both be hearing, and you can be born deaf. Very, very high percentage of deaf people in this village. It's, you can see it's 4% compared to 0.1%. So it's 40 times higher than what the deafness would normally be. And what's interesting about it, well, one of the things that's amazing about it is that the deaf people are not treated as inferior in any way. They're full members of this community. Now, why did I talk about this community? One of the things that's sort of part of my personal history is that, in fact, when we first started working on this language, it didn't have a name. It had no name at all. The people of the village are called Essayid. It's written Al-Sayed, it's actually pronounced Essayid. That's what the people are called. When the people who went there before us started working on it, the first people who worked in the village were doctors. And they treated these deaf people as kind of medical patients. And if you're a medical patient and a doctor publishes an article about you, they don't give you name, right? Because they don't think that that's sort of for reasons of privacy. When we started working on the language, in fact, well, at first we didn't know what to do. And finally we said to ourselves, now wait a minute, these people, this is a real language. So if we don't sort of use the real name of this village, we're kind of really hiding the fact that this is a real language. We're somehow pretending that it isn't. And so what we did was now the people in the village, they don't have a name for their language. It's sort of like the Arapesh, right? That's our language. I mean, why should we have a name for it? It's the sign language of the village. But we eventually decided, when we actually started publishing, that we would give the language a name in some sense, and this was the name. Well, Essayid is the name of the village, and we called the language Essayid Bedouin Sign Language. And that's the name that the language has had ever since. There's been a book written about it, so if anybody who's interested in Essayid can read this book, which is actually published by one of the chief obituary writers of the New York Times. Her name is Margaret Fox, former student. And there's a really interesting film which hasn't been released in this country yet. It's about the sort of, I guess, conflict in the village and among individuals about whether their children should get these cochlear implants. So I don't know how many people are familiar with those. That's, if you're born deaf, you can get a cochlear implant, which is kind of an artificial ear. And if you get it early enough, it can help you to learn to speak. It doesn't always work perfectly, but the film, which is a very interesting film, is about, it contrasts these two families. One of a young man who was grown up deaf, he has a family and he's very successful, versus this little boy whose parents decide that they're going to give him a cochlear implant. So as I say, Essayid is famous now. There's been books about it. There's been movies about it. And in fact, it turned out, we didn't realize this when we first started, there is actually an organization, there's a world organization that is devoted to standardizing everything. So when you buy a pair of shoes, how do you know that your shoes are going to be size 9 and not size 10? Right? I mean, when you buy a shirt, how do you know that the shirt is going to be the right size? Or when you buy a car, how do you know that the screws in your car are going to be of a certain, a certain dimension? And it turns out that there's an organization called the International Standards, the International Organization for Standards, which is actually, if you think about it, that is the secret world government. They run everything. This is the organization that determines globally how you can make things and how you can sell things. And it turns out, interestingly, they have, as I see here, there's 17,000 international standards. There is even an ISO standard, which is ISO 639-3, which is the international standard for languages. So this is the ultimate legitimation. This is global legitimation. So this is an international organization which has taken upon itself the task of deciding what is a language globally in the whole world and what is not a language. And what they do is, in order for a language to be in some sense legitimate, it has to get an ISO code, right? And there are currently these codes for about 7,600 different languages. These are 3-letter codes. And what we did a year or so ago was we actually wrote to ISO and we said, well, we have this language. And it's a new language, and it's a sign language, and it was created in this village, and we want you to give it a 3-letter code. And so we asked for SYD, because we thought that would be nice. And they wrote back and they said, well, sorry, SYD is already taken, but we'll give you a 3-letter code. And they gave us SYY instead of SYD. So Essayid Bedouin Sign Language is now officially, according to the International Standards Organization, is a language. So to sort of bring you back to where we started, what I tried to begin with was tried to take you back to the earliest times when people lived in these separate little groups. And they, in terms of what they regarded as legitimate, in terms of languages or even people, they only regarded themselves as legitimate. So the Greeks thought that, well, we're real people and everybody else is a barbarian, right? The Central Algonkians thought, well, there's Anishinaabe, that's us, and then there's everybody else, right? So the Iroquois, they're not really people. There's something else, but they're not really people. We are the only, that's I'm taking you back hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and to show you that at least that's how people used to be. Now, what's going on now is that, in fact, I think for a variety of reasons, because we now regard ourselves as, in some sense, a global society, what we have done is we've kind of said, well, all people are people. Now, we think that that's a normal way to think, but the point that I'm trying to make is really it's only in the last maybe 100 years or less that people have even had this notion to say all people are people. Before that, it was us and those other guys. And it was us because we spoke a real language, and those other guys, they didn't speak a real language, so they weren't real people, right? And that's pretty much, I think, the end of my story. So, thank you. Harry's already got a question. Chief Wallace.
Should we talk about an ISO code?
I don't know. That was the question I was hoping you were going to ask. That's exactly the question. I don't know. But it's a reasonable question to ask. And well, I could probably, if I could get online now, I don't know if I can, but I could find out in a few minutes. You just go to the ISO site and
I think it's listed with Montauk and Shinnecock. And I'm not sure who else, but there are like three languages among that have a 3-letter.
they do have,
Yeah.
okay, so
But
you
it's
think,
not individually isolated. I think Montauk does though.
so we could find out. So you don't think Shinnecock has a language code?
And so it's connected with Montauk.
So it's connected with Montauk?
And, yeah.
Right. But it's something, you know, you could certainly work toward. Right? What you have to do is you have to go to ISO and you have to basically present them with some kind of linguistic evidence that shows that that there are texts that exist, and the language does not have to be a language that is currently an actively spoken language. So if there is evidence that Shinnecock and Montauk are distinct based on linguistic evidence, I think you can get a separate code, but that's something to be worked on. Yes?
At what point does a language have to stray from its origin before it's considered its own language? And to be more specific, at what point is American English going to be called American?
Right. Well, so in French it's actually called American.
Oh, really?
So in French, they have two different languages. In French, if I say anglais, it means British English versus américain, which means American English. Well, there's a number of answers to that question. So one, the sort of facetious answer, but probably the true answer, is a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Right? You understand? So basically, it's a question of force. The technical linguistic answer is that we consider two dialects to be separate languages if the speakers don't understand one another. So you're not old enough to remember this, but when the Beatles first came to this country, and they would interview them on TV, they would run subtitles. Because the Beatles came from Liverpool, and their original speech, their actual, the speech of their hometown, was completely unintelligible to any native speakers of English. And so it's called Geordie, that's sort of the technical, it's sort of the local term for the dialect. And so, in some linguistic sense, it's probably the case that, that English and this language are really separate languages. I've done this more than once. Sometimes I'll get students from the Caribbean, so Jamaica in particular. And I had one student go home one Thanksgiving and record the conversation around the dinner table, and she brought it back to class, and the class listened to it. Nobody understood a word. Nobody understood, because they were speaking this Jamaican patois, which they'll tell you they're speaking English, but in fact, you can't understand. In fact, I had another student who wrote, and this can lead to problems. I had a student who wrote a PhD thesis on the West Indians in the courts in New York City. So, if you speak a foreign language, if you speak a language other than English, and you're a defendant in a court case, the court must provide you with a translator, legally, right? So if I speak Spanish, or if I speak Portuguese, or Swahili, whatever, then legally the court has to provide me with a translator. If I tell them I speak English, they don't. And what this guy did was he went into the courts in Brooklyn and looked at transcripts of trials of some of these West Indians, and it was very clear that they could not understand what was going on in the courtroom. because they said they spoke English, but in fact they didn't. So it's, it's an interesting question. A lot of it is political, but a lot of it is sort of purely linguistic. Hey, my Uncle Harry from Brooklyn, I don't know what language he spoke. It wasn't English, I can tell you that. Anybody else? Yes?
You mentioned the Beatles. So during the Ed Sullivan show, when they were playing it on those Sundays, they showed subtitles?
No, when they were interviewed. So when they sang, if they sang, that's a whole other story about the language that you sing in. It turns out that if you're going to sing rock and roll, what language do you sing rock and roll in? Anybody? Somebody said American. That's almost true. Southern African American. So when you sing rock and roll, you have to sing basically like Chuck Berry. You sing in Chuck Berry's accent. That's the accent of rock and roll. That's the language of rock and roll. So even the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, who were from London, if you listen to the Rolling Stones, when they're singing, they're trying to sing like, Chuck Berry, B.B. King. I mean, it's really an American, southern black accent.
Is that like Buddy Holly language too?
No, Buddy Holly's a whole separate thing. We don't want to get into that. Buddy Holly is, I don't know why I know about this. Buddy Holly is rockabilly, and that's separate from rock and roll. But you don't want to know. Well, I mean, we could discuss it, but maybe later. But what's interesting, actually, it is important because the point is that the language becomes identified with a certain culture. So it's, the culture of rock and roll is identified with a particular accent. And it's not legitimate rock and roll. So, for example, do you know who John Fogerty is? Right? John Fogerty is this famous American popular musician who sings in this kind of Cajun rock style, right? He comes from a San Francisco suburb. And I know where he grew up. I mean, he grew up in the equivalent of Massapequa. But he sings in this Cajun accent because that's part of that culture, right? If you want to be legitimate, see, it's a question of legitimacy. You cannot be a legitimate rock and roll singer and sing with a Massapequa accent. Then you're Billy Joel, and that's a whole other story. Yes?
I just thinking of the Rolling Stones singing, you can't always get what you want, and then they have a boys choir from England singing.
Yeah, but you can't always get what you say. Right. Yeah.
Think of the many encounters I've had with Scots, and it seems to me that that's, I think of them as speaking English, but it's often unintelligible English.
Right.
And what that makes me think is that we're not talking about hard boundaries. We're talking about fuzzy edges.
Right. Yeah, no, there are no hard boundaries. I mean, it's sort of the notion of different languages. It's what I was trying to say is it's what you do is you try and pull things further apart than they really are, right? So people try and use their language to create these identities where I think the linguistic differences are very small, but they can be used to create big social differences. There's a wonderful piece of work that was done in the 1960s by a very famous linguist named Bill LeBob. He went into different department stores in New York City, and he would ask people. He was looking for something that was on the 4th floor. And he would ask people, where's the ladies' dresses? And he had a little microphone hidden. And, some people would say 4th floor, and some people would say 4th floor, right? And what he did was he correlated the whether they pronounced the R or not with the price of the merchandise in the department store. And it turned out that in Bergdorf's, which is the fanciest store, people always pronounce their R's. Right? And the point is that in New York City, people use the pronunciation of R as a way of making social distinctions. People use language, that's what I'm trying to get. People use language to differentiate themselves from one another. And so you would say, oh, the person who drops their R's, I mean, New Yorkers will always tell you, well, as a student of mine once said to me, but Professor, I never drop my R's. Because in New York, you're not supposed to, right? I tell them, you can drop your R's all you want. The Queen of England drops her R's. Because in England, dropping your R's is considered high class, right? Actually, the guy whose name is, we're in the Anger Biddle Duke room, he probably dropped his R's. Because he was so high class that in his social class, it's okay to drop your R's. But anybody else?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.